and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Murray Pittock from the University of Glasgow. Hello, Murray.
Hello, Alistair.
And we're here to talk about your new book, The Shortest History of Scotland. I have my copy here. First of all, is this part of a series of books?
It is the shortest history series. I've done about 24 books so far, a mixture of countries and themes. So there's also things like the shortest history of war, shortest history of economics, shortest history of AI now.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. So this book is just over 200 pages. That's a lot of history to fit in. How did you approach writing it?
Well, I wanted to ensure that, first of all, everything that reasonably could be covered, the big lineaments were all covered. I wanted to ensure that it wasn't a succession of battles and monarchs, and that there were some sections which clearly spoke to what life was like in Scotland in past ages, and also what Scotland achieved in the world and how the Scottish brand grew. And I wanted to put one or two elements in which would encourage people, if they were interested, to see how complex and powerful the Scottish legacy of ideas was, and to pursue that further. I did that, for example, with regard to the Declaration of Arbroath.
Yeah, that's something I'd like to touch on later on. But you actually have all the monarchs in a handy section at the front of the book, which works well.
That's right. They're there to as a handy reference point. I mean, actually, the classics writer Mary Beard said in her most recent book about Roman emperors, no one can remember them. Well, I mean, I think probably she can, and I think probably I can, but actually, people don't remember kings and queens and emperors and where they fit in. So it is useful to have these lists.
It is, and it's also quite interesting to note how the names change and reflect the times as we move through the different monarchs. But I'm always interested in epigraphs, and you have quotes from Václav Havel and Edwin Muir. Sorry, can you talk us through the two quotes you have as your epigraphs?
Well, I mean, they're part of the dedication, which is to the Scottish Studies program and in Prague, Charles University of Prague, which has been one of the most strong and determined programs in Scottish studies, and indeed also in Gaelic and Irish Gaelic too. So they're both, of course, with reference the Václav Havel one explicitly to Czech nationality, and also the Edwin Muir one, which is the poet from the poem The Combat, almost certainly refers to the Czech Republic in the grip of the Soviet Union after the 1948 coup. In fact, Muir, who spent quite a long time in Prague with Willa, was due to give a radio program on the very day of the coup, and it was suspended and finally rebroadcast in 1989. So you heard fossilized Edwin Muir from 41 years before. So that's the reference point. And the reference point really is, as in The Combat, to the extraordinary persistence of Scotland, which hasn't, he was referring to the Czechs there, but it applies to Scotland, which has spent centuries without being a state, and yet is got one of the strongest national brands for a country its size in the world.
And Scotland's relationship with Europe more generally is something which kind of runs throughout the book, which is very interesting. But was it difficult to divide the book into eras or periods, or are they kind of widely accepted by historians?
Ooh, well, I'm not sure that any historians would like to say that they widely accepted anything, but I mean, I wanted to look at it in terms of terms broadly the national story. First of all, I really don't like it when people say so and so was an ex-writer, from a certain nationality which didn't exist when the person wrote and which he had no conception of. So we start with Scotland before Scotland, because you can't talk about Scotland. You can't talk about Britain either. You've got to talk about the geographical landmass, and then the self-definition, which is the struggle with England chapter, and then Scotland as a state, its its successes and failures in the medieval and early modern period, and then Union and Empire, and the importance of both to some of the greatest achievements of Scotland between 1760 and 1914, and then the modern Scotland, which is a story of decline and awakening, an awakening caused to some extent by the decline.
Yeah, absolutely. Go right up to the present day.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in when you can claim that Scottish history begins. You've kind of hinted at it. You've got the landmass. When do people start to, look back? Is it to do with early monarchs or early people?
Well, it was traditionally Kenneth MacAlpin who unified the country, but Constantine II is a better candidate from the beginning of the 10th century. But then on the other hand, some of the Pictish kings, Innes II, for example, ruled over almost the whole of modern Scotland, or a large part of modern Scotland. So you can actually take it back to the 8th century as well. Somewhere between the 8th and the 10th century, Scotland begins to cohere as a state, but never a state that was to become as centralized as England. I don't have much time to make those comparisons, but comparisons with England are the ones we always reach to, and they're the ones which are usually wrong, because England is actually quite an outlier in terms of how quickly and how powerfully it's centralized. So one of the funny things about Scottish understanding of our own history when we got it is that we frequently beat ourselves up about things that other small European countries would have found perfectly normal.
Yeah, I was wondering, it made me wonder about your second chapter is called The Struggle with England.
Mm.
And if this was a short history of England, do you think that relationship would be as defining as it is?
No,
No.
not at all. I think both Scotland and England cohered to some extent because of the Vikings. They pushed the kingdoms together. But I think that England's presence on the island has had an inordinately large and defining effect on Scotland throughout its history. For example, medieval kings, one of their measures of success was increasing territory. Some of them, like President Putin, seem still to be locked in that mindset. But in Scotland, that was very difficult. It's very difficult to increase territory because you had nobody next to you who was even roughly as powerful as you.
Yeah.
So you also had difficulty. One of the reasons Scotland didn't get coinage till David I is he had to get the silver mines in the north of England to provide enough bullion to mint his coinage. And Scotland was always massively short of silver in particular for its coinage, which is why the majority of coins found in Scottish coin hoards are from other currencies. But further down the line, of course, that gave Scotland the sense that currency wasn't sterling in the English sense. It wasn't a fixed thing. It was kind of fluid. And that allowed Scots to initiate all kinds of banking reforms in the 18th century, some of which, of course, we may be sorry for today. But anyway, that's another story.
What I think the book does so well is get behind the headlines, so to speak, behind the mythology, and look at the practicalities, just like you mentioned there, of why things were the way they were.
Exactly. And some of those are not, they end up being political issues, but they're not fundamentally about political actors making choices or fighting each other or competing. They're situations that are brought about by the geographical strengths and weaknesses of Scotland. I mean, the weaknesses I've just mentioned one. The strengths obviously are that it was geographically extremely difficult to penetrate.
Yeah.
At least until well into the early modern period, to the 17th and 18th centuries, and even in the 18th century after Culloden, there were lots of problems. So it was very difficult to keep a hold of. And that was in a way its benefit. What Walter Scott called, and I don't apologize using the phrase, the land of mountain and flood, land of my sires, in the last minstrel.
Another thing which has kind of become political, but which is interesting to read about how it fluctuated over the years, is language, and how the use of Gaelic and the Scots has changed over that period of time.
Absolutely, and I think it's once again there are a lot of politics, and there are a lot of politics in that today. And one of the things you find is that Gaelic speaking Scotland frequently uses non-Gaelic when it's writing, and Gaelic when it isn't writing. I mean, and that starts to change as Gaelic comes under increasing threat, and Gaelic writing to some extent develops in response to that to find its own space. But we're actually talking much more than we think of today, because Anglophones so seldom speak other languages. In terms of a society which is very often bilingual to some extent. It was, but whether there's quite widespread use of Latin, there's quite widespread use of Norman French, there's use of Flemish in the ports, and people have to understand these other languages to an extent in order to be able to function in society. I mean, I didn't have time to include the Aberdeen Grammar School's 1593 regulations, which allowed for 5 learned languages, including Gaelic, but not including Scottish, to be spoken in the school by the pupils, because Gaelic was regarded as a learned language in Aberdeen at the end of the 16th century.
Oh, that's really interesting. Can we talk a bit about the Declaration of Arbroath and why it remains relevant today, if you feel it does, but it's still widely talked about? I mean, what kind of document was this?
So the Declaration of Arbroath is, of course, signed by the barons of Scotland as a letter to the Pope to show their adherence, a conditional adherence, to King Robert of Scotland, Robert the Bruce, and to defend his right against the claims of England, which in the end was successful because the Bruce did win the the closed crown for Scotland, and all sense of subjection was put to one side by the time of his death. But the thing about it is that it's actually a lot more complicated than that, and we tend to be awfully simplistic in what we write and say online. I'm sure you aren't, and I hope I'm not. But these debates get very, very simplistic.
Yeah.
So. One of the complexities which was recognized a long time ago was that this Declaration of Arbroath contains quotations from other texts, and principally from Sallust's History of Catiline's Insurgency. And what I wanted to point out is, although this wasn't pointed out when this was first done in the 1940s, the specific bit of Sallust that is quoted is actually a letter from a deprived plebeian. And it's very interesting, because the plebeian is complaining about aristocratic oppression and its infringement on the freedom of ordinary Roman citizens. And right from the Declaration of Arbroath, there has been some narrative which has got stronger in certain parts of Scottish history, particularly more recently, which associates England in the beginning of the Plantagenets with aristocratic power, and Scotland with ordinary folk who just want to protect their corner of land, which has always been theirs, and don't want any more. I mean, to some extent it's rhetoric, but to some extent it isn't. And also the Declaration of Arbroath has a real root in the work of Duns Scotus as the premier philosopher of freedom, and as actually the developer in these Ordinatio of 1300 of a political philosophy based on a community coming together. He was probably thinking of the community of the realm of Scotland, but community coming together to choose their leaders. And his suggestion was, I mean, 3 centuries later, Hobbes thought if you chose your leader, that was it. You were fixed, stuffed for all time. If your leader turned out to want to eat you, well, you just had to reconcile yourself to be on the menu. But for Scotus, writing in 1300 was talking about the ability to change your mind, to change the leader if the leader didn't step up to the plate. And it's very clear, given Scotus was Scotland's premier academic in continental Europe. He was its premier theologian, and the bishops were the strongest supporters of the Scottish patriot cause in the early 14th century. So I think it's beyond doubt that Scotus had a big influence on the Declaration of Arbroath, which is why it's such a radical document.
Yeah, because I think it's described in the book as a social contract, and that in itself was quite radical for the time, because it suggests a democratic bent to it anyway.
Yeah, I mean that's probably it's probably too strong, but certainly the idea that there were a lot of stakeholders, and the stakeholders weren't limited just simply to the barons with whom the king by whom the king kept order. It is a revolutionary political document. It is one of the most important documents of the Middle Ages in terms of political thinking, and we just need to be proud of that. I mean, I pointed out in a newspaper article, not in the book, that actually when we had it was the then Alistair Allen put forward the motion to celebrate the Declaration of Arbroath in 2020 for the 700th anniversary, and to have a debate about that in Holyrood. Only 13 MSPs signed up. You have to have cross-party and you have to have substantial support. But as it turned out, all the 13 MSPs were SNP, but they were 1/5 of the total SNP parliamentary representation. So frankly, we're not proud enough of some of the things we've done best.
Do you think that's in part, this is something that was rattling in my head all the time reading this book, is I think that's in part because so many of us, and I include myself in this, just do not know our own history.
I think that's part of it. I actually also think that the kind of what I might call again neo-unionism, the unionism of extirpation and suppression rather than patriotism and support for Scottish culture, that actually makes people back away from celebrating these things because they're seen as tribal. Any inch of the Declaration of Arbroath is seen as kind of an absolute blank check to the yes side and independence referendum. But that's not the right way to look at it at all.
It's much too simplistic to kind of take these things and look at them in that way.
It absolutely is, and I think and if you think about the huge role that major unionist politicians like Lord Cooper had in actually creating what we think of now in the 20th century as the doctrine of Scottish popular sovereignty, which has been so important in all sorts of political debates since he made that call in his opinion of 1953 in McCormick against the Lord Advocate. Cooper was unionist MP for Aberdeenshire West.
Yeah.
I mean, but he loved Scotland and its institutions. So I think we really got to separate this to some extent for the constitutional question. Otherwise, we'll never come to terms with the complexity of our own past.
Absolutely. And I think in this modern day where you're either one or t'other and, and never the twain shall meet, that complexity of someone who could be unionist, you may even describe Scott as being that way, someone who can celebrate one, but love his country, be on the other side. People tend not to see that now.
No, I think they don't. They don't see how, excuse me, generations of Scottish unionists, and again, Scott was one of those, were actually rather concerned about things they thought were infringing on Scotland's rights. It's the change. It's the change in the modern era from secretaries of state like George Younger to secretaries of state like Douglas Alexander.
Yeah. So we've kind of touched upon England's relationship with England, and we'll move back to that later on. But I'm interested at the relationship with Europe at the time, because there was a lot of trade going on into Europe.
Well, I think one of the fascinating things about Scotland is that it develops institutions very early. That's one of the things that's particular about it. I won't say unique, but particular about it. So even as late as the 18th century, per capita of population, Scotland has more university places than anywhere else in Europe. And of course, many of the borough grammar schools have their roots really early in the medieval period. So a lot of men, it's true, this stage, were being produced who had a significant education, significant connections and networks, and there weren't enough places for them to flourish. And in some sense, they never have been. So they went abroad. And one of the distinctive things they did was not just to actually become merchants in the cities they went to, but to try and control the export trade of the goods of the country that they actually emigrated to or sojourned in order to make money from both sides of the equation. So Scottish merchants in Bergen controlled by the 16th century, sometimes up to 50% or more of its timber trade, because that was how they naturalized themselves in Northern Europe. It's a very important part of the development of Scotland, and the sense that Scotland always flourishes best when it's got a wider sphere in which to flourish, and that's leaving aside all kinds of stuff about the apologies about the empire or whatever it is. There's always been a wider perspective available. After all, it's Wallace who writes to Lubeck, the Lubeck letter, on saying Scotland is now back in the hands of the Guardians and not the English, and so we can start trading again. This stuff goes back centuries, and it's a really important part of the way in which Scotland developed.
The section on Scotland's boroughs is absolutely fascinating because you have trades organising. I can remember, I'm from nearby Rutherglen, where the kind of Guild of Tailors, I think it was, went
Yeah.
back a long, long way. And then from that, you had trade, as you've said, but also economic, growth, and also the education that you suggest, all coming from the formation of these boroughs.
You did, yeah, and they became focal points for networks. So the three basic rules of the Scottish medieval network, and is it very different now, are kinship, location, and association. Where do, are you related to me? Do you come from the same place as me? Did we study at the same school, the same university, or are we members of the same profession or the same guild? And one of the interesting things that happened on the continent is that people with that network tried to grow it by adopting people who didn't have it, and making them often their heirs in the business when they weren't actually kin to them. They created bonds of kinship artificially, as indeed, of course, happened in domestic Scotland itself to some extent, in order to create a wider network and a stronger set of associational bonds.
And at that time, we mentioned education, and you mentioned it as well, but Scotland's reputation as a centre for learning was well earned. I mean, how unusual was it to have a country that was setting up places of learning as Scotland was at the time? Over, 100, 200 years, a reasonably short period of time.
So, I mean, Scotland was certainly at the forefront. The Netherlands were extremely strong as well. So, and indeed, the Dutch universities, particularly Leiden, were not only influential on Scottish universities, but in fact, effectively, they acted almost as an extra university. They took more Scottish students than at least one, or if not two, of the Scottish universities. So Scotland was at the forefront, but not out on its own, I would say. But it helped to cement the bond with the Netherlands. And there was also the way in which, particularly after the Reformation, Scottish academics became every Huguenot college in France had at some stage or another a Scottish rector, who as well as Scottish staff. So they were very strongly admired for their their intellectual robustness, and their abilities in rational argument, and the ability to think clearly. So let's try and hang on to that. Sometimes it seems a bit wonky these days.
And education leads me on to think about Scots literature and who were the main writers in early Scottish literature. What were their traditions that they were coming from?
Well, I think it's broadly speaking, the reason that Dunbar and Henderson and Douglas used to be called the Scottish Chaucerians, a term which now riles everybody, is because they were strongly influenced by Chaucer, but they were also, particularly Dunbar, influenced by French writing and the development of high-end Scots, as in, for example, Dunbar's Hymn to the Virgin Mary, Hail still, supernal in etern, in goddess sector shine, lucerne in Darien, for to discern be glory and grace divine. Um, that has its roots both in Latinate and French Scottish culture rather than Anglophone Scottish culture. So there were other roots. And one of the interesting features is there's a long-standing tradition of translating Latin into Scots rather than English, which long survives the Union, in fact, lasts until the 1850s.
Mm. Because these were writers who were often writing at court. They had
Yeah.
high status.
Yeah, they absolutely at high status. Not Dunbar, I think, I don't think it's all opposed. Never had high enough status for him to be satisfied. Um, and, Henryson was both probably an academic at the University of Glasgow and schoolmaster at Dunfermline at various times. And Gavin Douglas was, of course, a bishop. And I think Douglas's translation of the Aeneid is very interesting because it's clearly a patriot statement about the Scots vernacular and its right to be seen as a major and important European language in the transition from Latin to the vernacular.
Do you think these writers are still not as well known as they should be? For many people, I think Scottish literature begins, and for some people ends with Burns, and not what went before and who went before.
Oh, I think that's true. I mean, I know McDermott said, back to Dunbar rather than back to Burns, but you know, they're medieval writers. Their
Yeah,
worldview is pretty tough
yeah.
for people today to ingest, and their language is staggeringly original, but
Mhm.
also almost unrecognizable for people who haven't delved into it. So they are a challenge.
Yeah, sure.
But we need, I think we need to uh, honor their contribution as a major one.
So a character who looms large in Scottish history, I think who many people will have heard of, is John Knox. And do you think his influence is overstated? Difficult
Well,
to overstate?
well, I think probably not. I think that he was extraordinarily influential, and he became um, what you might call a smokescreen candidate for the extent of the involvement of members of the Scottish nobility in the Reformation. In a way, later on, the Kirk of Scotland got rid of the Covenanters by preserving the Covenanting past as a wonderful history of achievement, which is seriously dead and is never coming back.
Right.
And so, in an earlier age, John Knox was not only had great influence, but got greater influence because it very much suited the narrative of the Scottish Reformation that it should be perceived as a popular, and to some extent it was popular, but as a popular Reformation which was led by an inspired religious leader, which enabled us to look away from some of the other aspects of it, which certainly suited some of the Scots nobility very well indeed.
Can you think of a present day figure who you could compare him to? You don't need to say it.
I think I think I mean Knox. Well, um, you're going to get a lot of comments on underneath the YouTube video if I say Nigel Farage, but
That's kind of who I was thinking about. I have to admit, Murray.
John Knox was a populist,
Yeah,
absolutely, no two ways about it. I mean, you know, first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women. He to some extent didn't notice that Elizabeth might think. He said, I don't mean you. You're one of my friends. You're one of the good ones. So you're a
yeah.
prop, right?" No, she actually did. She actually took some notice of the gender
Right.
reflection there as well. So, yeah, he was absolutely classic example. Some people are to blame for all that's gone wrong. They aren't one of us. Let's get them.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Now, one of the best things I found about the book is you create an easy to follow timeline. Now, for instance, I didn't realise that the massacre of Glencoe was only a few years before the failed Darien scheme. Now, to me, that seems like two completely different Scotlands, and maybe it was two completely different Scotlands. But do you find that some people fall down again? It's my own experience with when these things happen, the timeline of them.
I think they do, and I think part of that is the belief that somehow there's one bit of Scotland, which you might call the Highlands or clan society or whatever, which is moving at an incredibly slow pace and is really rather backward and detached. And another part, which is kind of Edinburgh and Glasgow, which is kind of moving along smartly. But it's really not a helpful way of looking at things again, because a lot of the Gaelic speaking landlords had titles and they had money and they had commercial interests. Campbell of Lochiel had commercial interests in the British Empire in the 18th century. This was not unusual.
Mm.
Their dependents may not have had overseas experience except as being exiled for political views or because they couldn't pay their rent. But that, frankly, went for people who were at the bottom of the social scale and didn't know Gaelic too. So I think you can separate out these figures like the Lords of the Isles and the chiefs of Clan Donald and put them in a quasi Turn and Ogue perspective where they never actually meet or write to somebody else of their same social background.
Right.
But of course they do. They're part of the same world.
Yeah. I think it might be nice to talk a little bit about the Darien scheme in particular, because I feel some people don't realise perhaps what it was and how it impacted on what's coming next.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. The Darien scheme was much more widely supported per capita in Scotland than the East India Company was, right, when the English shareholder issue. So really, a lot of well-to-do Scotland subscribed to the scheme. It was a classic Scottish imperial venture in every sense, which is it was extremely intelligent, highly ambitious, and if anyone objected to it, there was absolutely no ability to put military heft behind it at all.
Mm.
So that's what happened to it, and it had a big historical resonance. It's not, again, the idea that the country was severely damaged by it, but the idea that the country was bankrupt is a little excessive. It was very clear that the East India Company and the other merchant companies in England wouldn't be too keen on the Company of Scotland. So the Company of Scotland was effectively mothballed after the Union rather than allowing it to continue. But the very fact it wasn't really allowed to continue suggested that it was regarded as a bit of a potential threat rather than a complete busted flush.
So,
But it's also critical in that things like John Law, the founder of fiat currency, and of course a controller general of the French finances in 1720, he lost his brother in the scheme. So so many people had a personal investment, which led them later to become opponents of the union on a lifelong basis, because they saw the English crowns having let down the Darien adventurers.
so it's much too simplistic, I would guess, to say that the failure of Darien led to the union with England. It wasn't a case of bailing out a country in any way.
Well, the Scotland did not have a great deal of economic strength. After all, it had been spending a lot of time spending its GDP on deciding whether Presbyterian or Episcopal government should be the predominant way in which its Reformed Church was organized. And quite a few decades of the 17th century have been spent that way. So it wasn't in a good position, and there was also adverse climate development. But really, it was the Scottish estates' opposition to the Act of Settlement, which excluded the Stuarts if they remained Catholic from the throne. Not because there was a huge enthusiasm for getting a Catholic Stuart back, though there was in the country after the Union, but because Scotland simply hadn't been consulted, and the royal line of Scotland was going to be completely excluded in favour of the Electress of Hanover and her heirs. and that led to two acts, the Act of Security and the Act to End Peace and War, which really reserved an independent foreign policy to Scotland and gave Scotland the right to choose its own sovereign, independent of England, if so be it. And that raised a lot of concern because England was locked in the early stages of a life and death struggle with France, which would finally culminate in victory in 1763. And the idea that Scotland could become a French dependency by the back door was very much in the minds of the English government.
Yeah, that aspect of the book is absolutely fascinating as well, because again, it was something I know a little bit about, but I didn't know the strength of that concern. Now, I thought if I asked you the question, was the union with England a good or bad thing, we could be here for another 24 hours. But I'm not going to do that. But I was interested because what comes next in terms of Scottish thought is the Scottish Enlightenment that begins quite soon afterwards. And I was wondering if you thought that the Scottish Enlightenment would have been as it was without the union with England.
Well, actually, I think the Scottish Enlightenment starts earlier, and
Right.
I wrote an earlier book to that effect. So I put it really, and I'm not the only person who does now, in the last quarter of the 17th century.
Right.
So in a sense,
It's
the
already,
Enlightenment institutions were already moving. The union, the union's contribution is probably indirect contribution, probably comes in the area of history, where stadial history, the idea of national development and development through time, is pioneered really by Adam Smith. There are other claimants in his lectures on jurisprudence in the early 1750s. So coming to terms with the union, that which was the historian's job,
right.
that probably was influenced by the fact the union had taken place. But a lot of other elements of the Enlightenment were simply not so, and were already moving quite rapidly and decidedly by the end of the 18th century, 17th century.
And was that partly because you had these very established by this point university institutions that could um, produce some of the thinkers and other people that were involved?
It is absolutely. It's also because Edinburgh was one of the relatively few cities in Europe which was an early adopter of technologies of measurement, scale, and size. And those things tended, when those were adopted early in European cities, they tended to lead people to start to think of people. Could people be turned into data? What were we? Was there a science of man, as it were,
Yeah.
as the Enlightenment would have put it, to put aside this? So there are things which, like the development of the Edinburgh housing market in the last quarter of the 17th century, which sound like, how can that be to do with the Enlightenment? But actually, it was to do with the Enlightenment. One of the connections, quite simply, was that Hume always rented the most expensive close he could afford because he thought it would bring him next to the most influential people.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I love the practicalities again
Yeah.
underpin the kind of ideas and the mythology. And speaking of mythology, there's a section on Scotland, the brand, something which endures in a very real, tangible way today, economically and just in terms of the image of the country around the world. Can you talk a bit about that, Scotland, the brand? It's the kind of mythology around that is that it started with the visit of the King and Scott, bedecking Edinburgh in tartan, but obviously more convoluted than that.
So again, it's really begins in the late 18th century. It comes from the huge influence of Macpherson's Ossian, the influence of Burns, and the influence of kilted soldiers in both the wars of the 1760s and materially in the occupation of Paris after 1815, where the whole sets of contemporary French prints. And tartan then becomes embedded into French fashion in the 1820s, having been, of course, in many respects banned until the 1780s. So this Madame de Stael's famous essay on the ideas and the literature of the North. It's difficult to recover this huge influence. There are more than 300 pieces of music which have been composed on the Ossian poetry alone. And for the impact, as far as the impact of Burns goes, Burns looked as if he was a bridge between the folk culture that was being collected, for example, by the Grimm brothers in
Yeah,
their attempts to give ethnic ethno-linguistic identity to Germany, and the modern progressive thinking of German philosophers like Schlegel or revolutionaries like Freiligrath. So he just was a superbly good fit. And
mm,
many of these writers were. I mean, Scott influenced nationalist movements throughout Europe in the 19th century because his basic architecture, which is that Scotland is great, but it had to give way to the Union. But still, we lost a bit, and still you can see some characters who never fit in, and they got something to say for themselves, which was complicated and sophisticated. Generally, when Scott was translated, that was taken as this is about the rebels, and we
yeah,
like
we like the
so.
rebels.
And again, it fitted enormously well. And so exactly the Scotland that we fundamentally still sell today is romantic Scotland. That is our brand. That is our core brand. And the interesting thing was that developed worldwide after the Union.
Yeah. And it's still, as you say, used today and sold in that manner today. But there are modern takes on it. I mean, that's what I found really interesting is that people weave it into modern
Yeah.
technologies, modern culture, and all of these things, not forgetting what went before.
No, they do absolutely. I mean, and of course, the recrudescence of tartan globally, which starts in the 70s, has both had an impact in Scotland and on everything from haute couture to interior design internationally. I mean, I think that the V&A Dundee exhibition a couple of years ago was the first tartan exhibition to actually treat the phenomenon seriously and
Yeah.
to think about what it represented rather than kind of saying it's a Scotch myth and we don't like it. And, Ireland has no problem selling plastic leprechauns on St. Patrick's Day. So I think that we should really grow up enough not to worry too much about tartan.
Why do you think there is that? This is a generalization, but that cultural cringe when it comes to a lot of what we've been talking about, which there isn't in other countries, I think.
I think that's right. I think one of the things is that this international Scottish brand was widely associated with uh, both with formal uh, unionism, army, for aristocracy, formal dinners, dressing up Montrose and Prince Charles and Argyles in the evening, and also with the stage Scottishness of Harry Lauder and many others. So that's one of the reasons for the big post-war reaction. I mean, I think that's changed, obviously. If you look at wedding photos from the 1970s, it's amazing how few folk are actually wearing tartan.
Yeah.
And now it's been
Which,
totally compulsory for 30 years.
yeah.
So um, I think we have got over it in large part, but there's still some uncertain feeling about it, and I think that's wrong because we're dealing with an international phenomenon here. And I once, and this is a wee while ago, but 25 years ago, a visiting French academic asked me if she could I could introduce her to a barn supper, and she went to somebody who I won't say who it was in Scottish studies at Glasgow. Said, "Oh, you don't want to bother us with all that garbage, all that nonsense." And of course, she went and had a great time. But the fact is, there are barn suppers all over the world. There are
Yeah.
almost 10 million people going to barn supper from the ones, even the official ones that we know about every year. It's an enormously important opportunity to represent Scotland to the world that happens regularly and which involves a lot of people and which is a great has a great potential for everything from charitable giving to exports. So really, we really have to just to embrace what
Yeah.
other people think of us, even if sometimes we get a bit embarrassed about it ourselves.
Because the book ends with a mention of a new international Scotland. I was wondering if you could just expand on that idea before we finish up.
So what dimension of that were you thinking of particularly in
Well,
terms?
just this idea we've talked mostly about Scotland as a nation and the international scope of Scotland. Do you mean, I don't want to go into the specific politics of it, but you know you've mentioned that the Burn Suppers goes round the globe. I guess at the heart is I spoke to an American academic about 15 years ago now. We were in Spain and we sat beside me and he said, where is the Scottish diaspora? Where is the evidence of it? The Irish diaspora, I see it everywhere, but I haven't really seen the Scottish diaspora. And I thought by you finishing off this book by mentioning a new international Scotland, that was kind of touching upon that.
No, I absolutely. I see the we're referring to. Yes. The number of people identifying in the US as Scottish before and after Braveheart rose by 150%. So you always have to treat people's genealogy with a touch of doubt. But unquestionably, the Scottish events not have become more fashionable, and there are larger numbers of them. I think there are only a couple of states in the US without a Scottish event or festival. They are sometimes jointly themed with Irish festivals. And where they haven't become more popular, but were always popular, I think people in Scotland are more aware of them and less hostile. And some of them, for example, have really changed. So 20 years ago, the St. Andrew's Society of San Francisco sponsored a conference I was co-organizing in California at Berkeley. And they all turned up because they're invited because they were putting money up in these huge 17th century plaids, looking like figures who'd strayed out of Rob Roy casting. And now they meet every month to discuss issues about the Scottish economy and Scottish exports and Scottish technical innovation and governance. So, although a lot of US institutions are still very trad in terms of kilts and tartan, there are some that have actually translated themselves into engaging with contemporary Scotland. So we're in a time of change, of hybridization, of the fusion of Scottish and local traditions, as in fact, for example, the Burns New Year celebrations in Canada and the Western US, Gung Haggis Fat Choi, Burns and the Chinese New Year. So it's a very interesting time, and it's something we need once again to be better aware of and to engage with more fully, because Scotland globally and Scottish diaspora globally isn't just Tartan Week.
Yeah. Murray, I think that is the perfect place to leave it. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, and all the very best with what is a fascinating book.
Thank you very much indeed, Alistair. It's a pleasure to chat to you. Really good questions.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.